All right, let's jump right into it. Today, we're breaking down Operation Southern Spear, a U.S. military operation that, believe it or not, ended with the capture of a sitting president. This is a story that's got everything: secret airstrikes, totally conflicting narratives, and an entire region pushed right to the edge. And this headline? Wow, it just lays it all out, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of the firestorm that erupted. Was this a legitimate law enforcement action, or was it an illegal kidnapping on an international scale? That is the central question we are going to unpack today. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, the capture itself. Then we'll dig into what Operation Southern Spear actually was. From there, we'll get into the messy, conflicting stories, the huge questions about its legality, and finally, the fallout that has an entire region holding its breath. So, January 3rd, 2026. The world is just watching as U.S. forces carry out this stunning mission inside Venezuela and capture President Nicolas Maduro. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. This was the dramatic final move in a military operation that had been quietly ramping up for months. The official line from the U.S. wasn't active war. Nope. They framed it as a law enforcement action. See, Maduro was already wanted on federal drug trafficking and weapons charges. So right after they captured him, he and his wife, Celia Flores, were flown to a New York court where they both pleaded not guilty. So how in the world did we get to a point where capturing a president was even on the table? To really get that, you have to look at the official story behind the military operation that made it all happen. Okay, so this whole thing was officially called Operation Southern Spear. It kicked off in August 2025, and on paper, its goal was to fight drug trafficking out on the open sea. The U.S. said the targets were, and this is their term, narco-terrorists, specifically calling out groups like the Venezuelan gang Vega and the Colombian guerrilla group, the ELN. And just look at how fast this all happened. It starts in August with warships in the Caribbean. A month later, in September, you have the first airstrike on a boat. By October, it's not just the Caribbean. The strikes have expanded to the Pacific. Then comes the big one in December. The strikes move from sea to a land target inside Venezuela for the very first time. And just a month after that, President Maduro is in U.S. custody. Just an incredible escalation. And this is where the scale of this thing really hits you. And remember, this is all before Maduro was even captured. We're talking at least 35 separate strikes in just a few months, killing more than 115 people. This was not some minor police action. This was a sustained and deadly military campaign playing out on the high seas. But that official story, the one about targeting high-level narco-terrorists, it didn't take long for that to start getting some major pushback. And that brings us right to the core of the controversy. Who was actually on the receiving end of these deadly strikes? The difference here is just stark. On one side, you have the U.S. claiming its targets were these big-shot cartel leaders and terrorists, but then you have reporters on the ground, like from the Associated Press in Venezuela's Sucre state, who found something totally different. They found that a lot of the guys who were killed weren't kingpins at all. They were fishermen, taxi drivers, often first-timers who turned to this kind of work out of just sheer economic desperation. And get this, the Venezuelan government story was all over the place. Right after the first strike, a top official, Diosdado Cabello, just dismisses it as fake news. But as the attacks kept coming and the body count rose, that story completely flipped. The same officials then started calling the strikes extrajudicial murders. Okay, so with all these conflicting stories from all sides, you can probably guess what the next massive question is, the one being asked all over the world. Was any of this actually legal? Yep. This is the big one. This is exactly what human rights groups and foreign governments started asking immediately. Can you really target and kill people in international waters on foreign soil without any declaration of war and still call it legal? The legal backlash was fast and it was widespread. Now, the U.S. administration had its argument. They said they were in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants, which is a legal framework that lets you kill enemy fighters. But that view was pretty widely rejected. UN experts straight up called the strikes extrajudicial executions. A former prosecutor for the International Criminal Court even suggested they could be crimes against humanity. Even close U.S. allies like the UK got worried and pulled back on some intelligence sharing. But here is the crazy part. While the rest of the world is sounding all these alarms, back in the United States, it was a completely different story. A poll from October 2025 showed that a massive 71% of Americans actually supported the strikes. That is a huge disconnect between public opinion at home and the view under international law. So the US accomplished its main goal. Maduro was gone. But that opens up a whole new can of worms. And maybe the most dangerous question of all: what happens next? What are the real consequences of yanking a leader out of a country that's so deeply tangled up in criminal economies? Analysts are basically screaming about this. They warn that removing Maduro doesn't magically remove the problem. For decades, these criminal networks have woven themselves into the fabric of the Venezuelan state. And Maduro, for all his faults, he managed what some call a fragile equilibrium between all these competing groups. Taking him out of the picture creates an incredibly dangerous power vacuum. And there are some seriously powerful and violent groups just waiting to jump into that void. Experts are pointing to a few key players ready to fight for control. You've got the Colombian guerrilla group ELN, the massive Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, and even Brazil's powerful PCC, which has its eyes on Venezuela's illegal gold mines. Now, think about all those groups vying for power, and then add this number to that volatile mix. It's estimated there are somewhere between 1.6 and 4.1 million civilian-owned firearms in Venezuela. And that's not even counting the military's weapons. In a power vacuum, with armed criminal groups all competing for a piece of the pie, that is a recipe for an absolute explosion of violence. And that leaves us right here with this really unsettling final question. Did Operation Southern Spear actually solve a problem? Or did it just shatter a very fragile, very violent order, and in the process create a new and maybe far more unpredictable crisis for the entire region? With one leader gone, who or what is going to fill that power vacuum?